Hi, it's Rick Jones, and welcome back to Shaboom, the podcast for and all about my generation, the baby boomers. Today, unfortunately, I'm among the walking wounded. As you may see, I have a little, for those that are watching, I have a little patch on my ear. I had what I call my badge of honor. I had more skin cancer surgery on Monday. And so I'm wearing the bandage as we do this. For my generation, unfortunately, a lot of us are experiencing a lot of skin cancer these days. We're paying the price for going out and putting Johnson's baby oil on us so we could get even deeper tans and do all this kind of crazy damage to our skins. And that's what we did in our collective youth. In the words of Tanya Tucker, it's a little too late to do the right thing now, and so we're paying for it. But for my baby boomer listeners out there, this is a good time to remind you to really pay attention to your skin. I mean, look and see. If something changes, that could be a squamous cell, that could be a basal cell, that could be a melanoma. You really have to watch yourself. And, you need to get somebody else to look at parts of your body you can't see, like your back, and make sure there's nothing going on. And then you got to get it treated quickly and appropriately. Jimmy Buffett was my favorite singer of all time, and he died of skin cancer, essentially. It was a very rare, very, intense form of skin cancer, but it can happen to any of us. And so a little lesson today for everybody as we start episode 6 of Shaboom. Today, the word of the day is reinvention. Boy, isn't that true about our generation? Our generation didn't get many gold watches. We didn't stay places. We moved around. We went to a variety of jobs, varied jobs with varied experiences. Many of us moved a lot physically as we chased opportunities. And that was kind of rare for our parents and our grandparents' generations. Most of the previous generations before baby boomers tended to work in the same job for their entirety of their careers. And we saw a lot of them work until retirement. And then they moved either to Florida or to Arizona for the last years of their lives. But it's different for baby boomers. I looked the other day and I saw that once I got out of college, I have had 14 jobs in my career. Got out of college, started as a teacher and a coach at Frederica Academy, then became a coach at Sewanee at the University of the South. Then in graduate school, worked for a law firm, McCurdy and Candler, clearing title objections in real estate deals. Then, still in grad school, went to work for the Decatur school system so they would waive out-of-state tuition, and taught elementary school PE and coached soccer at Decatur High School. Then was an assistant basketball coach at Georgia State. Went to work at Georgia Tech as the marketing director for the Georgia Tech Athletic Association, left there to go to work for a PR firm where my boss had gone at Conan Wolfe. Then went out on my own, started my first agency, Rick Jones and Associates. Then was hired by the San Antonio Golf Association to run the Nabisco Golf Championships in San Antonio. Formed another agency that became the Strategic Group. Then sold that agency and became part of Advantage International, which is now Octagon. Then formed yet another agency that became the Gym Group. Finally created first Fishbait Marketing and then Fishbait Solutions. And now in this fourth quarter of my life, I have an agency called Heartland Pirates. 14 different experiences, but I wouldn't trade any of them because the journey has been really fulfilling. Plus, I had a chance to teach sports marketing at 2 great institutions, at Georgia State, where I got my graduate degree, and at the University of South Carolina. So lots of jobs, all fun, all challenging, all worthwhile. My philosophy of life and business is if it ain't broke, break it. I like doing things differently. I like learning new things. People will often come to me for advice, young people today, and will say, Rick, I got 5 years of experience. And I'll go, well, not really. What you have is 1 year of experience repeated 5 times. And you want to try to avoid that if you can. I'm just have always been a lifetime learner. I love to read. I love to try to learn new things. I want to go new places. I have a long bucket list. It keeps you fresh. Teaching graduate school really kept me contemporary because you're dealing with young people that can smart a phony and they can smell a phony faster than any other generation. And so you had to keep up with the times. What's new in technology? I mean, I'm trying to learn a lot about AI right now. I'm 72 years old. Why do I need to know about AI? Because I need to know about AI. It's very, very important. I had a boss named Chuck Jarvie, great mentor, great friend. He told me one time, he said, Rick, you're never going to make a whole lot of money. And I said, well, Chuck, why's that? He goes, because you get bored too easily. And he's right. I do get bored. The good news is because I get bored, I've never been boring. And I've really never been bored. So my question for you today is this. Are you bored? Well, if so, maybe it's time you do something about that. My song of the week on our playlist is the classic Lyle Lovett's It's Closing Time. Hint, hint, it's not closing time for your impact. In fact, if you're a baby boomer, you still got a lot of great years left to have impact. And so I got a few other songs about reinvention and change on our playlist this week. There's a great Fleetwood Mac song called Landslide. The song by Diana Ross called I'm Coming Out. Tracy Chapman had a wonderful song called Fast Car that Luke Combs later did a cover of that, and they together did that song at the Grammy Awards, which is one of the great events ever. I Can See Clearly Now by the great Johnny Nash, and finally, one of my favorite songs of all time is from the legendary Nina Simone. It's called Feeling Good. My guest today is my dear old friend Marc Kidd. He practically invented the word reinvention with a multifaceted career in literally all phases of media, and I'm proud to have him today on Shaboom. Marc, thanks for joining us today on Shaboom.
Hey, Rick, it's great to be with you. Shaboom. I love the name. I love what you're trying to do here. And so for me, it's a real delight.
Thank
You
you.
know how important you've been in my life over the years. So it's just great to reconnect with you here.
Well, this is terrific. We're going to have a lot of fun today. I always start with everybody with the same question. Where were you raised? Tell me a little bit about your childhood and who were some of the people that influenced you?
Yeah, I was unique. I ended up being born on a college campus, and we lived in university housing. And I can remember when Alumni Coliseum was being built, and we lived in university housing until I was 13 years old. And ironically, there were four little houses down a road that sat just to the south of the stadium. And so we'd look out the front window, and the football field where my dad coached was right in front of us. And so I would run around and play on the campus, and I would go in when school was out. I'd go run through the dorms, and I could pick up posters and whatever the kids left behind. And living in a college campus in the 1960s was pretty cool. And so that's where I grew up in
Well,
Richmond.
Eastern Kentucky, your dad, Roy Kidd, was a legend. I mean, he really
Yeah,
was. I mean, he had a tremendous career. It's kind of rare what he did, a guy that stayed with that kind of longevity.
I
Every other
mean,
coach has always told me there are two kinds of coaches, those that have been fired or those that are going to be
gonna
fired. But your
yeah,
dad avoided all that.
he did. He was when I was growing up, first of all, he was a high school coach in Madison County at Madison High, and the first season he was there was the first year of integration in 1957. And in those days, it wasn't uncommon to see water fountains that said whites only, blacks only. Same thing with bathrooms, those types of things. So Dad went to his first practice, and the kids came together, and they had, probably 20 some odd kids. And after practice was over with, there was a group of kids that kind of stayed back and others over here. And the group that stayed back was the black kids. And one of the guys, his name was Potato Head. Is what they referred to was his nickname. He came up to Dad and he said, "Coach, where are we supposed to shower?" And Dad looked at him and said, "What do you mean, where are you supposed to shower?" And he says, "Well, the white kids are supposed to shower in there. Where the black colored kids supposed to. He said, Are you going to play with the white kids? And he said, Well, yeah, coach. We said, Then get your butt in there and shower with them. And through that integration and through that process, dad was probably one of the most revered people in the African American community in my hometown. And I can remember spending as much time in that community as I did in our community in and just all the people we got to know through that. All the football players that came through the program. He was a guy that didn't see color, he just saw talent. And so I grew up in that kind of environment. And the time we had on campus was for me incredibly special. I look back on it. I can remember having discussions around the dinner table because in those days, and dad didn't want your hair on your collar. He wanted to have it trimmed correctly and properly. But it was a time when riots were happening on campuses, things were going on, a lot of social change was happening. Marvin Gaye's great song, What's Going On, was taking place in that time. And he would talk about, deciding whether to let kids have mustaches. If he did, would it land at the end of your lip or would let it be a Fu Manchu? How long would your hair go? Would it be on the collar or not on the collar? So I grew up at that time when all these things were happening. And I can remember probably my earliest memory was living on campus in the early 60s. And I remember being upset because Saturday cartoons were not available because of John Kennedy's motorcade funeral. And so I distinctly remember some of those kinds of things. And growing up on a college campus with all the things that happened during that period of time, I find myself really fortunate. And the thing I learned from being around dad is that he would work with people to create a team to help people be successful. And those techniques and those philosophies and really that way of life was something that I just grew up with. And so when I got a chance to be in business, the question for me, I thought at this stage of my career, I would be a conference commissioner or an AD at a big college. That's really was the path that I was on. And just didn't turn out that way. Other things came my way that became interesting.
But it's interesting, I've always told people that being a coach was a terrific foundation for running an agency because the first thing you realize as a coach is you can't play. You better
No.
get players. And the same thing in being in leadership. You think about
Yeah.
the jobs that you've had and the people that have worked with you, and it really is putting together that team of unique
Oh,
talents that blend to be able to create success.
no question about it. My first job, I made a list of 10 people that I knew and the family knew, and I made a list of the 10 things that I wanted to try to do. And at the top of that list was, a guy named Jim Host, who was an entrepreneur in Kentucky that had been a former lieutenant governor and a big staunch Republican. And my dad called him and said that, I was going to come over and interview with him. And Jim said, Roy, I don't have a job. He said, That's okay, Jim. He'll be over to see you tomorrow at 7 in the morning. So just take his meeting. And I appreciate it. And he hung up. And I showed up at Jim's office. And I went in and I remember just sitting down and I said, Mr. Host, before you say anything, I know you don't have a job. I'm just here to tell you that I want to come to work for you. I'm interested in the things that you're doing in radio and broadcasting and those types of things. I was a broadcasting major at Eastern, and I'll come to work and I'll work for commission only if that's what it takes to be able to make something happen. And that's how I ended up going to work for Host Communications. And Jim, of course, was a very connected person in the college community and the Republican community. He was very close to Mitch McConnell. He had run political campaigns and done a number of things in that vein. And so it was just a very, very interesting, exciting time. We happened to have the rights to the NCAA game programs, and we had the rights to the NCAA radio network. Ironically, a former sports information director of my father's who grew up in Harlan, Kentucky was Dave Kaywood. And Dave at that time was actually at the NCAA and he was responsible for the programs and sports information and those types of things. And so that relationship blossomed through a connection to create. I mean, we worked with the NCAA for 23 some odd years, helped them do everything from their first radio networks, their first game programs, we developed the first website. We did created the NCAA Woman of the Year award, and ended up, getting involved in pay-per-view television and a bunch of other things with the colleges and universities. So the experiences and the things I was exposed to early on were really remarkable, and I was so fortunate to be in that position because in a million years, you wouldn't have those kinds of opportunities. So I grew up in a big city or someplace where there were big media companies.
Well, I tell people that, there are family trees in the sports marketing communication business. One of them was Mark McCormick's tree at IMG. One of them was the Donald Dell ProServe to Advantage tree. The host tree is amazing. The people that
Yeah.
came through host communications that Jim touched, that have gone on to do so many other things within the industry is staggering. Clint Overby's a great friend of mine who runs
Be a great one.
ESPN events,
Yep.
started at
Fantastic.
host. Devin Edwards at
Mm.
CBS, who started at host. They just, I mean, we could spend all day talking about people. But Jim was a guy, I think he was the ultimate why not guy. There, there are a lot of people in business that are why guys. But not Jim Host. Jim Host was a why not guy. And he also
Exactly.
really believed his sheer pull of his personality could make things successful. But he was great for young people like you at the time to
Oh,
say, Mark, go figure it out.
he would. I mean, great story. My wife and I used to joke because I would say, "Well, look, Jim's out playing golf, so when he gets back, I'm going to have a list of 10 things to do, and I'm not sure what that's going to be." And so he came back from a golf trip and had been playing golf with the CEO of Sara Lee. And he said, he called me in on a Sunday and I came in the office. I said, "What's up?" He said, "Well, I met with the CEO of Sara Lee and we got to talking and we decided we're going to create the NCAA Woman of the Year and they're going to sponsor it. And they're going to give us $2 million a year. And we're going to build a whole platform around it." And I said, "Oh, that's amazing. What is it going to be?" He said, "Well, that's what we're here today to figure out. I've got a whiteboard over here and you and I are going to figure out what is this thing and how are we going to run it and manage it." And that kind of stuff happened all the time. I worked for him for a period of time. I left and went to work for a developer because I thought I wanted to be I thought I might want to, be involved in development, and I hated it. It was one of the worst things I'd ever done. And I called Jim and told him I was going to come see him again. And I met him at 7 in the morning, and I said, "Look, I know you don't ever hire anybody once you leave them, but I understand that you've got the rights to the Southwest Conference Radio Network. You don't have anybody that is down in Texas. I'm willing to move down there and run it. So it won't be like I'm really coming back to work for you here with these people, that they'll see somebody that was here and left." And so we ended up coming to accommodation. And I also knew that my girlfriend at the time was a flight attendant at American Airlines. She was based in Chicago. And I'm thinking, well, if I can get to Dallas and she can get to Dallas, Dallas might end up being a good place for us. And sure enough, Jim hired me back. I came down here to run the Southwest Conference Radio Network. And Amy was able to transfer. And we bought a little house and started our life. My son was born here, and I have such fond memories. Dennis Robinson was affiliated with the conference, and Jim Brock, the big personality from the Cotton Bowl, was there. And so all those people I got to know. And what Jim had is he had relationships both in the athletic world, but he had real strong relationships in the media world because our partners were CBS. You mentioned Donald Dell. Donald was our partner when we had the rights to the NCAA Final Four and we televised them around the world. So I can remember being in Paris at the Hermitage Hotel when Gore was running for president, and I was in the steam room with Donald Dell, and we were waiting for the returns to come back in because Donald's daughter was working on his campaign. And just those relationships and the places that it took a little boy from Madison County, all these places, was really remarkable. And if it hadn't have been through Jim and my opportunity to work there, none of that would have happened.
Well, I went to Frank Craghill's funeral recently, and Donald was there. He actually sat in
Mhm.
front of me in the church, and again, he was a larger than life personality that kind of created things. But Jim was the same way. Two quick stories about Hoss Brock. There was there was a there was a great story that I think the year Baylor finally won the Southwest Conference, and Jim Brock wanted Texas to be in the Cotton Bowl every year. I
every
mean,
year.
everybody else was second-class citizen. He wanted the Longhorns every year, and so you finally got Baylor coming to the Cotton Bowl, and they asked him, Hoss, you got to be excited about those Baylor Bears coming to the Cotton Bowl. He said, hell, those Baptists are going to drive up I-35 with a $10 bill and the Ten Commandments and not break either one of them. And it was just
He was that kind of guy. I mean, my office in the conference offices was I shared a wall next to Jim, and he always called everybody Hoss. Hoss, how you doing? Good to see you, Hoss. He was all involved in the media stuff. I remember going in his desk right when all the media guys came in, and I kid you not, there was a mountain of media guys just stacked up on his desk everywhere. And he was sitting behind him. He always had a cigar he was chewing on. He had boots on, feet up on the desk, sitting there. Said, Hoss, come on in. Look at all these media guys. Isn't things great? The football season's going to be here before you know it. And it was just, he was infectious. And I loved the guy. I mean,
yeah,
truly loved him.
one year Houston won it, and they asked him if he was excited, and he said, Houston, half of their alumni work at 7-Eleven, and the other half are holding it up.
Oh, exactly. I mean, you can't make that up. And the other thing Dallas had in addition to that is they had guys like Brad Sham was a radio broadcaster in those days. I got to work with these just wonderful talent. Frank Fallon at Baylor. When we were doing all those types of things, I really got to work with some of the best broadcasters in radio in the world. And we were on these Clear Channel stations like WAI, which is owned by Clear Channel, and I could listen, and I used to listen to that in my bedroom. You could hear that WHAS. So those kinds of experiences were things that for me were just magical and really helped shape my life. And as I say, I thought those paths would have taken me to a conference commissionership, or when we created and developed, NCAA football to be able to promote the game, the motivation behind it was to try to fit, because in those days, the average season ticket holder was about 70 years old. The conferences didn't really get their branding out the way they wanted to. And so when the commissioners decided to come together and we talked with the idea of developing this thing called NCAA football, that led to, decals being on uniforms where the conferences could get paid a licensing fee. We created a whole marketing platform. Probably the best thing we had a program called Take a Kid to a Game. But the best thing we ended up doing was we went to EA Sports and said, hey, let's do a NCAA football game like you have for NFL. And in those days, you couldn't do image and likeness, but we were able to get permission to do something because that didn't exist. So you could use the schools, you can make all that stuff happen. And that game, I think, brought a whole generation. I mean, I watched my son play it and others play it. So those types of things had a real impact in the fan base, in kind of the excitement and enthusiasm of college sports, up and down the ranks from Division I all the way down to the Division I AA's where my dad competed.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, it was a unique time or a window it was almost like a laboratory of trying to figure out what could you do differently. And Host Communications was such a leader in that field, and you were a big part of that. This show today, the word of the day is reinvention. And I think you would have probably stayed at Host had Jim not sold the business.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
it
would
just
have.
changed the dynamic. Because after you had left and come back, it really was family, and you really were family. But you had a chance at that time to go work with another legendary guy, Jim Wilburn. Talk about that, because again, he's a guy that a lot of people don't know Jim Wilburn, but he was so innovative in television in the outdoor space.
I got the guys from Anheuser-Busch had recommended me to Jim. Jim said he wanted to hire somebody to come in and help him run the business, and they needed somebody that has sales background, understand, how to do broadcasting, those types of things. So anyway, I get a phone call from him. I meet them I go up, I take Amy. They rolled out the red carpet. They were fabulous. He had a partner named John Baker. The two of those guys had built a tremendous television facility. They had trucks. They were doing a lot of, they did all of the horse racing on ESPN. They did rodeo. They were doing just all kinds of things that couldn't get a rights fee. And I got so close to taking the job, and I couldn't leave host, and I decided I wasn't going to do it. So I went back and stayed at host. I told Jim then apologized. I just couldn't get there. And then I just then it was that was the time when Jim I could sense after we sold the business that I didn't think Jim was going to survive it. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in it. And but I had a contract. And so the people that owned the business was Hilton Howell and his father Mac Robinson, and so I went to see Mac and Hilton and called him, and I flew to Atlanta, went in and met with him, and I said, I appreciate very much you guys taking my meeting. I'm here today because I want to let you know I've got a 3-year contract with you guys, and I want to leave, but I want to continue to do the things that I've been doing for you, and I'll take less money, and I will continue to help you on the NCA, help you on the things that you've got. But I also want to explore some other opportunities. And so we went back and forth, and I had worked with an attorney before I went to see him, and I had the attorney go through this, and I said, I want you to make this fair to them and give me the rights to continue to do what I'm doing, but I want to go over here and explore these other opportunities. So I agreed to take less money. They agreed to let me stay on. They signed the contract when I was in the room. And when I flew back to Dallas, I called Jim and told him that I had resigned, but that I was still going to be a representative of the business. And I don't think he expected that to happen. And for me, I can remember sitting out here in Plano thinking, okay, my first call, and my wife said, "You're going to go see Jim Wilburn." So I called Wilburn up, and we agreed to meet on an Indian reservation halfway between Dallas and Tulsa. There was a little restaurant in Krebs, Oklahoma, a little Italian restaurant we went into, and it was just the three of us. And I walked into the room and I said, "Before we start an order, I just want you to know my wife told me to accept whatever you offer. So whatever you put on the table, after we go through this conversation, I'm going to take it." So sure enough, I went through, explained the background, the history. I told them I was ready to come to work. They made me an offer. And I said, I've got one other request before I agree to it. And they said, what's that? I said, if you'll let me take 30,000 of my offer and you'll pay my secretary instead of paying me, and you'll let her have health care because I didn't have insurance, I will be 3 times more valuable to you and I can get a lot more work done. If I don't have her, then I'm not going to be as productive. And they said, we'll do that. Shook hands. I brought on B. I went to work for Wintercom. I rented a little space here in Plano, and that's where the next 30, well, I guess it's been, gosh, 20 some odd years of my life started. One of the guys that was also incredibly important and continues to be incredibly important in my life is Mark Shapiro. And Mark's wife, Kim, her father, she's from Louisville, Kentucky, and her father used to write jingles for us at Host Communications. He would come into the studio, create these wonderful jingle packages that we would use for our broadcast and radio shows. And so I knew her from those days, and and she got married, and he had told me that that at that time he was between jobs because he had been at Six Flags and he was trying to decide what he was going to do, and he was advising Ari Emanuel on them making the purchase of IMG, and so he was really helpful to just be a sounding board. And then when I took the job at Captivate, he had called me about that opportunity. If it hadn't been for Mark, I wouldn't have even considered the job. And I get a phone call, and he says, "Hey, I've invested in this company called Captivate, and the guys that are backing it, one of the guys in Texas are really good guys, and I think it's something you should look at." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, they operate screens and elevators." And I'm like, "Mark, who gives a damn about screens and elevators? Why would that be anything I'd want to do?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what," he said, and he went through and he said, "It's really about the audience they reach, Mark." He said, "They're in these high-end office buildings, are very, very influential, high net worth individuals. I think you ought to at least be willing to listen to it." And he said, "I think it's something you and Jim should consider." So I called Jim up. Jim's like, I don't want to work that hard and I don't want to do that. He said, "But I'm happy, if you go on and pursue it." So I met the guys from Generation Partners, and I liked them. And the irony was the same day, Shapiro had called me. I was talking to my son Seth, just catching up. And at the time, he was working for an investment bank in Chicago. And I said, "Hey, I got a phone call from Mark." He said, "Yeah." He said he had mentioned this business that has screens and elevators. And Seth goes, "Oh, are you talking about Captivate?" And I'm like, wait a minute, how do you know Captivate? He said, "Well, Dad, it's in my building." I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No." I said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "I love it." And he said, "It's got, news and information scores. It gives you something to do in the elevator." And I said, "Wow." So at that point, I started listening to these guys and met with them, and I decided to take the job. Jim said he didn't want to do it, and I said, "I'll take the job if you'll let me bring Jim on the board, and I would like Shapiro to be on the board." And so Mark's our chairman, Jim's on the board, and the guys at Generation have been phenomenal. And man, the interesting thing about those guys is they'd been involved in big equity deals, had worked with, Wall Street, had worked in San Francisco, and they had put together kind of a small fund to do things they liked to do and wanted to do. And one of their backers was Todd Wagner, and Todd had been a partner of Mark Cuban's. And when I was at Host Communications, they had a little business called broadcast.com, and we used to put the radio rights on dial up, and people could dial in and pay to listen to your favorite football team or basketball team when you couldn't get access to it. When we found out that they were going to do it on the internet, it's like, wow, this sounds kind of cool. So we did a deal with them to put it on there, and it exploded. It really took off and helped us. And then broadcast.com went on to just be sold for billions of dollars. They
To
did
Yahoo.
incredibly
Yeah.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'll never forget this, though, is Amy and I had been overseas on vacation, and I get back, and in those days you had voicemail, and I had a phone call from this guy. He said, I need you to call me. The broadcast.com, Todd Wetner and Mark Cuban have got something for you. And I'm thinking, well, this is weird. So I called him up, and the guy said, they they set aside the share of stock for you. And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, because you've been involved in the business." I said, "Okay, well, that's fabulous. What do I need to do and what I need to owe you?" And he said, "Well, you can send me a check. And this is what you need to do." We said, "Or I can sell it for you. And this is what will happen." And by the time I got back, the value of the stock had just exploded. And, those two guys helped me buy a little baby grand piano for my daughter. I mean, for my wife and my kids that they all wanted. So it was really about connections, relationships, and serendipity that opened up all these interesting opportunities for me. And I leaned in because I loved it, and it was fun.
Well, Bob Knight once said, look and see, listen and hear. Those are different. If you look at your career, you have surrounded yourself with great friends and business colleagues that brought value to you, but you also could look out and see things that other people didn't see. And I think leaders, in my opinion today, they have to see around corners. They really do. And it's a rare gift to be able to do that. And you've been able to do that. But at the end of the day, no matter what we do, we've always been in the people business. It's
Yeah,
about the people you
yeah.
deal with and the people you surround yourself. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, just as an aside on Bobby Knight, Bobby used to be the color announcer on the NCAA telecast and the NCAA radio broadcast. And so I remember being in rooms with Bobby as he was planning how he was going to do the broadcast, his philosophies. I'll never forget every year at the Final Four, I would run around and do the microphones at press day. And so the coaches that were playing would come in, and I'd take the microphone to the press guys as they were asking questions of Bobby Knight. Bobby Knight gave a master class at the Final Four on that Sunday press conference about how to be a coach, how to be a person, how to make you be the best person you could possibly be. I learned so much from that guy just being around him. And I think the thing that I benefited from is I grew up with a coach. I grew up with access and exposure to all these other wonderful coaches, and they were all about teaching people to be the best version of themselves. And you had to you had to focus on what you could control. That was the thing I learned is you could worry about a lot of stuff. I'll never forget being at a game right before we were coming out at halftime, or excuse me, before the kickoff. The storm was raging and about to come. And I said, Dad, what are you going to do with kickoff? I said, the weather, the rain. He said, Mark, he said, I can't control the weather. He said, I'm just going to go up and go tell kids tales. I don't care about that. I'm going to worry about what we can control. And I think that's really the lesson is you worry about what you can control and what you can influence, but you also have to trust your instincts. And when you're going to run a crazy play or do something, you've got to trust that someone else can execute it for you. And to your point, it's not what you know what you can do, it's what you can empower other people to do on your behalf and to let them flower and become what they're capable of being when sometimes they don't want to take a risk. You got to push them.
Well, one of the things I remember about host communications and what Jim would do was y'all would bring a very esteemed group to the Kentucky Derby every year. You know, the
Oh,
Derby is
man.
such a I mean, it's such an iconic event. My wife still says of all the sporting events in the world we've been to, it is by far her favorite, continues to be her favorite. That first Saturday in May is really, really special, but y'all did it right. I mean, and what was really good was Jim had the ability to look and say, this person I'm doing business with needs to know this other person I'm doing business with. I'm going to make
Yes.
sure they
Yeah.
get to know. And you know, that's kinda leaving your ego at the door a little bit and saying, if I help this person, it's gonna come back to me at some point."
Yeah.
But it's really about connecting those dots, and you've done a great job of that too. I mean, you've like I said, you've surrounded yourself with a lot of really, really smart people, but you've allowed other smart people to meet other smart people that you know, and so you've been a great what I call dot connector of people.
You want to help people be the best they can possibly be. And you talk about horse racing, the connections and the relationships. Jim had the radio rights to Keeneland. It was a little radio track in Lexington, Kentucky, and that led us to do the broadcast of the Kaywood Ledford was the talent. Kaywood may have been the very best horse racing caller in the world. If you want to really have look up Kaywood Ledford Kentucky Derby call, and they've got his call on YouTube, and he was phenomenal. And he did
He
all of
was pretty
Kentucky's
good calling the cats too.
called the Cats. He was the voice of the Final Four. And when I was at host, his office was right literally across the hall from mine. And I would spend a lot of time with Kayward was a notorious smoker. You'd walk in his office, there'd be a cloud of smoke and cigarettes everywhere. But he was also a very natty dresser. And he was quite the media machine. We could do a lot of things for him. He had been at WHS in Louisville. He grew up in Harlan, Kentucky. He knew Dave Kaywood and he was, those kinds of experiences for me in a state like Kentucky was pretty remarkable, and to have access to those types of things, I was really fortunate. And then Jim Wilburn had the television rights to the horse racing on ESPN. So he did the Churchill Down, he did all those things. He did the race of the day. He got involved in rodeo, and I remember going out to Las Vegas for the rodeo. So all those relationships, we got to meet and know people, and those connections are still in my Rolodex. I could reach out and call Steve Rimplis in Las Vegas, and he'd take the call tomorrow. And those types of things are important. You don't call unless you need to, but if you need to, baby, they'll be there for you because of the relationships and the things that you did together, in your professional life. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I've told people this: behind every successful man is a very surprised mother-in-law, and you know, you and I share a club. We're both way
Oh,
overchecked with
oh,
our wives. Amy was a flight attendant, and y'all really love to travel. And I
we
think
did and
Italy's your
do.
favorite place still,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
talk
yeah.
talk a little bit about some of the places y'all been. I think you take a group every year or every other year or something, and y'all go. Talk a little bit about that.
We do. We try to take a big trip every year. We've got two friends of ours that John Maloney and David Wagner, who we got to know when we first moved here. And John and David are super special. They've been, and we had Ruth Lindsley, who recently passed. Ruth was also a part of our group. Ruth was FDR's great granddaughter, and so the Roosevelts have a place down here, and Ruth was part of our group, and Ruth was a character. She was she smoked her cigarettes and she drank, 8 ounces of tequila, and she just lived a great. And I've probably been in more foreign countries with that woman than anybody. And same thing with John and David. And John and David were in the import export business, and they would go to China, and they used to do business with the military, and they made handbags for numerous people, everybody from Furla to big brands like Saks Fifth Avenue, Neiman Marcus, those types of people. And over time, they we had a girlfriend of ours, Becky Sharp, who lived here, and Becky also was involved in the fashion space, and she got hired by a young designer from New Mexico by the name of Tom Ford when Tom was brought in to manage the Gucci brand. And so he reached out to Becky, and Becky moved from here to Italy, just outside of Florence, and started working for Gucci. And she bought a little home and started fixing it up. And there was an old ruin that was available. And she called John and David and said, "Send me $250,000." And they're like, "What do you want $250,000 for?" She said, "Send me the money. I found some place that I'd like for you guys to have." And they said, "Okay." So she sent the money. They bought this ruin, and they spent probably a year and a half, 2 years redoing it. And so they're about 45 minutes outside of Florence. And I go over there to see Becky. John and David will usually be there, and we're usually there in the summer for a week to 2 weeks. Our plans to be over there probably in July this year. And we've been going back and forth over there for probably 20 years. Met some of the most interesting, unique people that would come there. We've had people that are from Canada that were lawyers that had been that had been in Russia working. And when all things started kind of deteriorating in Russia, they came and spent some time there while we were there. And then they ended up going to Dubai. So it just opened up a whole different way of thinking about things and the people. And yet you're in the middle of really vineyard country where there's wine grapes and stuff being pulled together. It's very agrarian, but the Italians do things right. And the way in which they would make their leather goods were just impeccable. And then there's an outlet that my wife would want to go to every year that we were over there to get stuff. So the connection to Italy has been super strong. When my daughter wanted to get married, we decided to do it at John and David's house. And so we went over, we put a tent out, and it was literally probably the crowning moment in a father's life to be able to have a situation like that. And it was just fabulous.
Well,
So we've got very strong
talk
ties.
about being a grandfather now. You got 4 grandchildren, the little ones. Talk about that joy.
I think the thing I see is that the traits and the genes, the concept of immortality is a tough one for people to get their arms around, because we all know that our physical bodies will in fact pass and return to the dirt. However, the genes do live on. And I do think the genes are an expression of immortality because you see it in your grandchildren and in your children, whether it's the color of their eyes, this chin. All of my grandchildren have this same chin except for one, and she happens to have Asian grandparents, and she has an Asian chin as opposed to this chin. The eye colors, little things that they do, ways they'll look at you, things of that nature. You'll see those things. So immortality to me is passed along through the genes that go on to your heirs. And I think it's an incredibly powerful thing. And to see them come about and grow, it's madness when all the grandchildren here, we have 4 under 4. They're just, and it's also euphoria at the same time. We're so happy to be with them. We were just in Austin a couple of weeks ago with our grandchildren there. Before that, we'd been out in San Francisco with Samantha and her kids. So we try to spend good quality time with them. Not a day goes by that I don't talk to one of them on FaceTime. I mean, FaceTime is the best thing that could happen to grandparents and grandchildren because you can stay connected. You can see what's happening in their lives. They call me Big Poppy, like I said earlier, and it's a fun time, and it helps you realize that it's not all about work. It's not all about the things you obsess over. It's those little moments that really make life worth living.
Well, it's why we work ultimately. I mean,
Yes,
it's
it is.
I tell people all the time, I'm trying to make it really difficult on my children to be better grandparents than I'm going to be to their kids. We're going to take them places and do a lot of fun things. Well, Mark, I do the math. I try to do it about once a week, and no matter how I do the math, I realize I'm in the 4th quarter of my life. I'd like it to be halftime, but unfortunately, it's the 4th quarter. what's still on your bucket list? What I mean, you're still having a great time at Captivate. You're doing, great work. You're having great family time. You're traveling and all that. But is there anything else that's you kind of want to do?
The last thing I want to do is help the private equity firm that has backed me and been a part of this stuff transition this business to new ownership. So that'll be the next goal for me, is to get the business in a position where and someone will want to take it over, and then we'll decide whether I have a role or I don't have a role. But my goal is to get them at that place. Once that's done, I plan to spend some time with my wife going and doing whatever she wants to do. We're going to take a kind of a world tour to the places we haven't been. I haven't had a chance to go to Hong Kong. She's had a chance to do that. My daughter's involved in a lot of travel, and so I want to spend some time. We went on a tour through the Nordic country, and I fell in love with it. And so I'd like to go back there. We will spend some time in Marrakesh and some places like that that we haven't been to. So we'll go on little mini trips on various places that we haven't had a chance to go once I retire and be able to do that. And that would be the next stage for me. And I'm, spend more time with my wife. She's been my partner forever, best friend, drives me crazy, and I know I drive her crazy, but she is something special, and I would not be, who I am, or would I have the children that I have without her. So I'm lucky like you, and that's what I think makes life worth living, is not forgetting work is an opportunity to create a living that you can provide for other people, but it is not who you are and what you are. It's just a place for you to be able to make a difference in the things that you want to do. And Captivate's been a phenomenal place for us. And we, went through a pandemic that could not be more punishing for a company that makes their living in office buildings than us. But yet we transformed the business through the pandemic. We made decisions to go to the cloud, to really improve our tech stack and do a lot more with programmatic. And a lot of people would have said, just shut down and don't do anything. And we decided, now we're going to lean in and do it because there's nothing else to do. So we might as well execute on the plans. And so we did that. And we came out on the other side with a way different business. And we also decided to diversify from just office buildings into residential. We decided we'd create what we call a Go Stick, where we could basically plug it into any device connected to Wi-Fi, and our service would start running. That opened up the ability to play on other people's screens, and all those things, from working with Google in 17, 18 to use their Chromium browser to figure out how to bring it into digital out of home. Those things made a tremendous difference in the business. And the pandemic, instead of hurting the business, which it was tough on, actually helped us accelerate what the business is today. I'm not sure we would have done it without it.
Well, Mr. Churchill once said, "Never waste a crisis," and you didn't. You took advantage of it in such a way. Mark, if you could look back, think about that little boy growing up in university housing,
Mhm.
and you could see what you've done, where you've been, who you've met. It's been quite a journey. Your reinvention has been really interesting because I'll look at you as somebody that every step of the way you built on what you learned and who you did it with, in such a captivating way
Well,
to finish with Captivate is pretty impressive.
I have a picture of me when I was probably that little boy I told you about and you mentioned. It's in my bathroom, and I'm on the football field in this jacket that was too big for me that my dad had got for me, and there's all these dirty football players, and I distinctly remember being there at that time, and I never forget that boy being on that campus, all the things that meant to me and to my family. I miss my dad every day, and, it's just it's, um it's a meaningful memory, and I'll never forget it, and I will always be that boy at a certain level.
Well, that's a great way to end.
Yeah.
It's where we start. It's how we get there. It's where we end up. You've been a great friend. You've been so successful. You and Amy are just great human beings. You got a great family. You've had a great life, but you're not done yet. And that's the part of Shaboom is, as Yogi said, it ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over yet.
Well, you've been a part of my business career on a number of different fronts, if you think about it. And, our interactions together, our working together were some of the funnest things. I mean, working the stuff we did with Bill Battle and those guys was crazy and fun. And, when you have a chance to work with those kinds of people, if you just pay attention and absorb it, it will make you be a better person. And if you take that with basic principles of goodness and kindness and thoughtfulness, you can make a difference in life. And that's what I want to do. And that's what I hope I can do. And I think it lives on through the genes and through the people that you know, and that gets passed on. And that is ultimately what immortality, I think, really, really is. It's been great to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Shaboom.
Thank you, buddy. Talk to you soon.
It's now time for the boom. It seems like we're always criticizing politicians for changing their minds. We call them flip-floppers. Well, don't we all change our minds? I remember a long time ago, I loved vanilla ice cream. Now I love chocolate. Does that make me a flip-flopper? It's okay to change your mind. Why do you change your mind? You get new information. You get new perspective. I saw something on Facebook this week when the great actor Henry Fonda was dying. He had been estranged from his daughter, Jane Fonda. And it was because he was a conservative. He was a Republican. He was in favor of the war in Vietnam. And she was the complete opposite. And it caused a rift in them, and between a father and a daughter. He's on his deathbed, and she comes to see him, and he apologizes to her. He says, I was wrong. I was wrong about Vietnam. I was wrong about what you did. I'm proud of what you did. I'm proud of you for standing up. He changed his mind. Folks, we still have time to change our mind because only a fool doesn't. And that's today's boom. It's time to get back on the road with Rick. We talked about Marc living down in Dallas and working with the Southwest Conference at one time. I lived in San Antonio during the era of the Nabisco Golf Championships, and there was a wonderful restaurant down there called the Gray Moss Inn. It's kind of in the hill country outside of San Antonio. Started in 1929 by a woman named Mary Howell. And then it was reinvented several times. They would cook these amazing steaks and chicken and other things on grills outdoors in a patio. So you'd sit outside under oak trees, lights, watch them grill your steaks, have a great bottle of wine. Really, really good. Well, it was closed for a while. COVID got them closed. They ended up selling to a family that now has a premier northern Mexican cuisine with wonderful traditional Mexican dishes. Again, that many of these are being grilled on these outdoor grills. You need to try this place outside of San Antonio, Texas. Here's a bonus. While you're there, they claim the ghost of Mary Howell is there with you. It's the Gray Moss Inn in San Antonio, Texas, on the road with Rick. It's now time to take a trip down memory lane. I mentioned the fact that I got to San Antonio originally by being the marketing director for the Nabisco Championships. That was the first tour championship. The tour championship is now held annually at East Lake Club there in Atlanta, Georgia. But in 1987, it was the first year of the season-ending PGA Tour event, and I was fortunate to be hired. But the truth is, I really had three bosses. If you would have asked the San Antonio Golf Association, who actually ran that tournament, who I worked for, they would have said them. If you'd asked Dean Beeman, who ran the PGA Tour, who I worked for, he'd have said, heck no, Rick works for me. And if you'd asked Nabisco Brands, who was the sponsor of that tournament, who I worked for, they would have said, absolutely, he works for us. Well, that's how you do things. You make sure that you're able to, placate all the constituencies because everybody has to win. The Golf Association has to win, the PGA Tour and their players has to win, the sponsor has to win. That's life. That's the way it is. One of the great joys of that is I became great friends with a guy named Mike Reichman, who has been my lifetime friend. Mike did a really fun thing that week. What are you going to give the top 32 golfers in the world? They're making a $2.5 million purse. They got all the perks they need. What are you going to give them? Well, Mike went up to Justin Boots, and he got them to come down and custom make boots. We didn't have a cut. All 32 players are going to play all weekend. They measured them. They picked out the boots they wanted, and during that week while they played golf in San Antonio at Oak Hills Country Club, Mike had their boots made and delivered to them before they left San Antonio. Years later, I bumped into Ben Crenshaw, who was one of our Team Nabisco guys who played in that tournament, and he said, "Rick, I still have my boots." And it was a great, great story. That particular tournament in 1987 was the last regular PGA Tour event won by the great Tom Watson. It was a par 3 finishing hole, and Tom had begun to get the yips a little bit with putting. And Greg Norman birdied 18, one-stroke lead for Tom Watson. He's on the tee box, knowing a bogey would tie it. He hit the ball about 4 inches from the pin, had a really easy putt to birdie and won by 2. It was a very special time for me. The Tour Championship is a great event, but I was there for the first one, and it was special on a trip down memory lane. It's time for the last word. We mentioned that so many of our generation are not getting the gold watch, and we're not moving to Florida or to Arizona to golf courses. So where are we going? Studies are showing that a lot of my generation are going back to college towns, going back to the places where we matriculated years and years ago, places like Athens and Oxford, Chapel Hill, Charlottesville, College Station, State College, all these wonderful college towns. What a great opportunity for schools to invite seniors, baby boomers, back to their campuses, to enrich their campuses, to be involved with their students and student athletes, and maybe even leave them some money as they leave this earth. And that's my last word. I want to thank my pal Marc Kidd for being my guest today, and for each of you for listening in today to Shaboom. We hope you will join us again next week for another edition of Shaboom. And if you like what you're hearing, I hope you'll share this with others who might also find it fun and informative. We'll see you next week.